My father gave me away for a payout, then had the nerve to demand I support him. At dinner, he pleaded, "I need help. I'm losing everything." I replied, "You lost me first." He wept. Then his new wife stood up and screamed, "You owe him for being born." I never expected to see my father again, let alone sit across from him in a dimly lit restaurant while he begged me for help. If you had told 13-year-old me that, decades down the line, this man, the one who had signed me away for a payout, would be weeping into his overpriced steak, I would have laughed in your face. But here he was, an old man now, his fingers trembling as he gripped his fork. His voice was thick, desperate. "I need help. I'm losing everything." I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch between us, let him sit in the weight of his own words. Then, finally, I set my glass down and looked him dead in the eye. "You lost me first." His face crumpled like paper. His lips parted, but no words came out. He swallowed, a ragged breath escaping him, and then, just like that, the tears started. Silent, pathetic. Then his wife, Carla, the woman he had chosen over every obligation he once had to me, slammed her hands on the table so hard that the silverware rattled. "You owe him for being born," she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to turn heads at the surrounding tables. I inhaled slowly, staring at the woman whose presence in my father's life was as much of a mystery to me as his entire existence had been for the past 26 years. I exhaled, closed my eyes for a second, and I let myself remember. My father, Ronald Ross, wasn't a good man. That much became clear to me before I even reached my teenage years. He was never outright violent, never the kind of person you could point to and say there, "That's the villain," but he had a way of making people feel disposable, unnecessary, like burdens he never asked for. My mother, Maria, spent the better part of their marriage trying to be enough for him. She tiptoed around his moods, pretended not to notice when he came home reeking of whiskey and bad decisions. She made excuses, swallowed her disappointment, and stayed long past the point of love. But then she had me, and something shifted in her. I don't know what finally broke her, whether it was the way he forgot my second birthday or the way he brushed her off when she told him she wasn't happy anymore. But one day, she sat me down in the tiny kitchen of our apartment, took my hands in hers, and said, "Baby, we're leaving." I was 13. I didn't understand the weight of what she was saying, not really. I thought maybe we were going on a trip. Maybe she had finally saved up enough money to take us somewhere, just the two of us. But when I saw the packed suitcases in the hallway, I realized it wasn't a trip. It was an escape. I don't remember feeling scared. I just remember feeling relief. Then my father came home. It's strange, the way some memories are burned into your brain with perfect clarity. The way you can recall a single moment with such vivid detail, even when years of other memories have faded into a blur. I remember the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, the way his eyes flickered to the suitcases before narrowing in on my mother. "You think you're taking my son?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharp and dangerous beneath the surface. "He's not your property, Ron," my mother said, stepping between us. I don't remember what he said next. Maybe he argued. Maybe he called her names. Maybe he laughed, because the idea of her finally standing up to him was too ridiculous to take seriously. But I do remember the moment it all changed. The moment his expression shifted from anger to calculation. "How much?" The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Thick, suffocating. My mother stiffened. "What? You want him?" My father leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes cold. "Then pay for him." I remember feeling small, like an object in the room instead of a person. I wasn't a son. I wasn't even a kid anymore. I was a transaction, a number he could put a price tag on. My mother, God bless her, didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse, pulled out her savings, and shoved it into his chest with shaking hands. "Take it. Sign whatever you need to sign. Just let me have my son." My father didn't even look at me when he took the money. He just counted the bills, nodded to himself, and left the room. And that was that. He was gone. For the next 26 years, I never heard from him. Until 2 weeks ago. His voice on the phone was older, raspier than I remembered. But it was still him. "Tony," he said, "it's your father." I should have hung up. I should have pretended I didn't hear him and blocked the number. But against my better judgment, I stayed on the line. "I need to see you. It's important." Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell. But another part of me, one I hated, was curious. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to tell me he regretted everything. So I agreed. And now here we were. He wiped his face with his napkin, sniffling. The restaurant was too nice for a man, supposedly on the verge of losing everything. The soft candlelight, the polished silverware, it all felt like a joke. "I know I wasn't the best father," he said finally, voice thick with regret. "But I raised you, Tony." I scoffed, shaking my head. "No, you didn't." His jaw clenched, and Carla shot me a glare. "He did his best," she snapped. I turned to her, leveling her with a look. "He sold me." She flinched, like the words had physically struck her. That's exactly what happened." I interrupted, my voice steady. "He didn't fight for me. He didn't try to keep me. He put a price tag on his son and walked away. Carla opened her mouth again, but my father lifted a hand. Stopped her. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was fixed on the table, on the untouched food in front of him. His fingers curled around his napkin, twisting it like he wanted to wring the guilt out of himself. Please, he murmured. I'm desperate. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about it. Then I remembered every birthday he missed, every Christmas, every late night I spent wondering why I wasn't enough. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. And I knew, in that moment, that I was finally free. The chair scraped against the polished wood floor as I stood up. I expected someone to stop me. Carla, the waiter, even my father, but no one did. The restaurant was too quiet now, tension thick in the air. I could feel eyes on me from the surrounding tables, the subtle shift in energy as people pretended not to eavesdrop while listening intently. My father didn't lift his head. He sat there, shoulders hunched, a man who had spent decades convincing himself he would never have to answer for his choices. A man who had never expected that, one day, the son he abandoned would look him in the eye and refuse to save him. I reached for my wallet, not because I owed him anything, but because I refused to let him think I had walked away out of pettiness. I dropped a few 20s on the table, enough to cover my meal, my drink, and the tip. Carla's voice cut through the silence like a jagged knife. You think you're better than him, don't you? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I turned away, weaving through the maze of white tablecloth tables, the low murmur of conversation picking up again as the restaurant collectively decided that whatever drama had just unfolded was no longer their concern. But before I reached the door, my father finally spoke. Tony, I hesitated. Not because I wanted to, but because there was something in his voice that pulled me back. Something I hadn't heard before. Fear. Not the fear of losing money or the fear of embarrassment. It was deeper than that. I turned, just enough to glance at him over my shoulder. He was staring at me now, his face hollow, his mouth slightly open as if he had more to say but didn't know how to say it. His fingers trembled as they clutched the napkin in his lap. And for the first time, I saw him not as the man I hated, but as something far worse, something pathetic. A man who had run out of options. I'm sick, he finally admitted. The words landed between us like a weight, heavy and unmovable. I didn't respond. I just waited. He exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the table like he needed to steady himself. I have nothing left, Tony. No money, no house. And I can't. He paused, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the raw, ugly truth beneath his carefully constructed persona. I can't do this alone. Carla reached for his hand, squeezing it. Ron, honey, don't beg. I'm not begging, he snapped, pulling away from her touch. His eyes were locked onto mine now, desperate, pleading. I'm asking. I had imagined this moment so many times before. Dreamed about the day he would finally have to suffer the way I had suffered. Picture myself standing over him while he groveled, maybe even laughing in his face the way he used to laugh at my mother when she begged him to be better. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything. I swallowed hard, fingers curling into a fist at my side. My mother had raised me better than this. She had raised me to be kind, to be strong, to be someone who didn't let bitterness dictate his life. But she had also raised me to be smart. And right now, I wasn't sure which part of me was going to win. The weight of his words hung in the air between us. I'm sick. I studied his face, searching for some sign of deceit, but all I saw was exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from a bad day or a rough week. This was something deeper, something that had settled into his bones. His skin, once tan and firm, looked sallow under the dim lighting. His eyes, which had always been sharp and calculating, were dull now, rimmed with the kind of darkness that sleep couldn't fix. For the first time in decades, I saw him as a man, not just the villain of my childhood. And that realization made me feel worse, not better. Carla kept looking between us, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping his wrist as if she could hold him together through sheer force of will. He's telling the truth, she said, softer now, her voice no longer full of venom. It's his kidneys. Stage 4. He's on the transplant list, but, well, you know how that is. I did. Too many people, not enough organs. A waiting game that most didn't win. Something inside me tightened. Not sympathy, not yet, but something dangerously close. Still, I forced myself to stay rooted in reality. This man sold you, Tony. He didn't care about you for 26 years. And yet, what do you want me to do about it? I asked, voice flat. Carla let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. What do you think? You're his son. You could get tested. You could stop. My voice cut through hers like a blade. She stopped. I turned my gaze back to my father. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at his plate, jaw tight, knuckles white against the tablecloth. He looked like a man who had gambled everything and was realizing, too late, that he had lost. He didn't say it, but I could hear the unspoken words lingering in the air. I need you. And that was the part that made me want to laugh. Or scream. He needed me. Now. Now. When there was nothing left for him to take. Now. When his body was failing him. When his money was gone. When he had no more moves left to play. Not when I was 13, standing in the doorway with a backpack full of clothes, watching my mother count out every last dollar she had to buy my freedom. Not when I was 15, struggling in school, wondering why I wasn't enough for him to fight for. Not when I was 18, working 2 jobs just to afford community college, while other kids had fathers who helped them move into dorms. Not when I was 25, newly married, wishing I had someone to stand beside me at the altar. Not when I was 34, signing my divorce papers, feeling like a failure, like maybe I was the problem all along. No, he didn't need me then, but he needed me now. And for the life of me, I couldn't decide if that was justice or cruelty. Carla was still staring at me, waiting. Tony, she said, softer now. I know you're upset, but you're his family. You can't just. I shook my head. Don't tell me what I can and can't do. She blinked, taken aback by the cold finality in my tone. My father, still silent, let out a slow, shaky breath. He was waiting, too, for me to say yes. For me to say, fine, I'll fix this, just like I've fixed everything else. For me to be the son he had never been a father to. And the worst part? A small, broken part of me wanted to. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much I hated him, no matter how many years had passed, he was still my father. And I still wasn't sure what to do with that. I ran my tongue over my teeth, a nervous habit I hadn't realized I still had, and exhaled slowly. The walls of the restaurant felt like they were closing in. The flickering candle between us cast shadows over my father's face, deepening the hollows in his cheeks, making him look even smaller than before. For a man who had spent his life pretending to be untouchable, he looked disturbingly fragile now. I should have left, but I didn't. Instead, I slid my hands into my pockets and rocked back on my heels, staring at the ceiling like I could find the answer there. So what? I muttered. You called me after all these years because you need a kidney? Carla let out a sharp breath, her irritation bubbling back up. Don't be so dramatic. He called you because you're his son. I turned my gaze to her, and she faltered, shrinking slightly under the weight of it. He called me because he's dying, I corrected, and I'm the only option left. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She couldn't, because we all knew it was the truth. My father finally shifted, sitting up a little straighter, like he had finally decided to participate in a conversation about his own life. His eyes were unreadable now, part pleading, part resigned, part something else I couldn't name. I don't expect anything from you, he said quietly. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. Bullcrap. His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. You do expect something from me. I continued, voice sharper now. You expect me to be better than you. You expect me to be a bigger person. You expect me to sit here, ignore everything that happened, and save you. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His fingers flexed against the napkin still clutched in his lap. He didn't deny it, because again, we both knew it was true. I turned my attention back to Carla. And you, I added. I don't even know you. You've never met me. But you still have the audacity to sit here and tell me I owe this man something. She flinched, her carefully maintained mask cracking just a little. Her lips parted, but she hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. I'm not saying, yes, you are. I cut in. You're telling me that blood automatically makes me responsible for him. Then no matter what he did, no matter how he treated me, I should just, what? Forgive him? Pretend it never happened? Slice open my body and give him a part of me just because he happened to contribute some DNA? She had nothing to say to that. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looking at my father like she was hoping he would step in. But he didn't, because there was nothing to say. I exhaled sharply and dragged a hand down my face. My skin was hot. My jaw ached from how tightly I was clenching it. The storm brewing inside of me was getting harder to contain, harder to swallow down. I needed to get out of here. The walls felt like they were pressing closer. The sound of clinking silverware, low conversation, the too loud hum of the restaurant's heating vents. It was all too much. I reached for my coat. Tony. His voice stopped me. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief second, willing myself not to turn around. Not to give him any more of my time, my energy, my anger. But then he said something else. Something I wasn't prepared for. I regret it. The words were soft, almost swallowed by the noise around us. But I heard them. And for the first time since I had walked into this restaurant, my father looked like he meant it. Regret. The word hung between us like cigarette smoke, bitter and stale. I had waited 26 years to hear him say it. Had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. His voice cracking, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own shame. But now that it had finally come, now that the words had finally left his mouth, they fell hollow. He regretted it? Which part? Selling me? Walking away? Living his life like I had never existed? Did he regret it because he truly wished he had done things differently? Or because he was old and sick and scared of dying alone? I knew which answer was more likely. And that was the part that made my stomach churn. I adjusted my coat over my arm, watching him carefully. He wasn't crying anymore, but his eyes were red-rimmed, unfocused. Carla was rubbing his back now, whispering something under her breath that I couldn't hear. For a brief, fleeting second, I saw what she saw. A man who was drowning. A man who had spent his entire life standing on solid ground, convinced he was untouchable, only to suddenly find himself sinking with no way to claw his way back up. It was almost sad. Almost. I exhaled through my nose, glancing toward the restaurant entrance. I needed to leave before I did something stupid, but my father spoke again. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I stayed quiet. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. But I need you to know, I did think about you. Over the years. His voice was raw, like it physically hurt to admit. I wondered if you were okay. If you hated me. If you ever, I don't know, thought about me too. That last part made something inside me twist. Because of course I had thought about him. I had spent years thinking about him. When I was a teenager, I thought about him every time I saw another kid's father show up to a football game or a school event. Every time I had to write something for class about my family, I had to decide whether to pretend he was dead or admit the truth, that he had just chosen to stop being my father. I thought about him when I was 25, sitting in a bar the night before my wedding, wondering if I should call him. Wondering if it would mean something to hear him say he was proud of me, even if it was a lie. I thought about him after my divorce, when I was at my lowest, drinking too much, feeling like a failure, and wondering if I had inherited all the worst parts of him. I had thought about him so much that he had lived in the back of my mind like a ghost, lingering in the spaces between every moment of my life. And yet he had the nerve to sit here, in this overpriced restaurant, and ask if I had ever thought about him. I let out a slow, humorless breath, and shook my head. You don't get to ask me that. He winced, nodding slightly like he had already expected that response. I took a step back. Another. My body was practically screaming at me to go, to walk out of here and never look back. But my father, this man who had once been larger than life, untouchable, unshakable, looked up at me, his eyes pleading, and said, I don't want to die alone. And for the first time that night, I hesitated. I stood there, frozen. His words lingered in the air, desperate and heavy. I don't want to die alone. That was it. That was the real reason we were here. Not because he missed me, not because he loved me, but because he was terrified of his own mortality. It wasn't about me. It was about him. It had always been about him. I let out a slow breath and finally pulled my coat on. Yeah, I murmured. That's a shame. His face crumbled. Carla gasped like I had slapped her. You're heartless, she spat. I ignored her. I had spent so many years feeling guilty, wondering if I'd been too angry, if maybe deep down, my father had loved me in his own selfish, broken way. I had spent so many nights thinking about what I would say if I ever saw him again, if I would finally get the apology I deserved, if I would ever get closure. But standing here now, watching him shrink under the weight of his own consequences, I realized something. I already had closure. Because he was afraid. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of dying. Afraid that he had burned every bridge until there was nothing left but smoke and regret. And I wasn't afraid of anything. Not anymore. I took one last look at him, the man who had chosen money over me, who had left me behind without a second thought, and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just the cold, simple knowledge that this was exactly what he deserved. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Carla's chair scrape against the floor as she stood abruptly, her voice shrill with fury. You'll regret this. You owe him. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I walked out of that restaurant and into the cold Chicago night, letting the sharp wind cut through me, grounding me in the present. The past was behind me. The man who abandoned me was behind me. And this time, he was the one left waiting.